Most people think they understand what happened during Caitlin Clark's rookie season. They remember the sold-out arenas, the record-breaking television ratings, the jerseys flying off shelves faster than any player in league history, every highlight, every logo-range three-pointer, every viral clip that seemed to push women's basketball into an entirely new era. But the real story of that season didn't happen under the bright arena lights. It happened behind closed doors. Because while the entire world was focused on the chaos unfolding on the court, something much bigger was quietly developing inside the Indiana Fever organization. A power shift that almost nobody saw coming. At first, Caitlin Clark was just another rookie. A 22-year-old phenom stepping into a league full of veterans who had spent years fighting for recognition and respect. The expectations placed on her shoulders were enormous. She wasn't just expected to perform. She was expected to save an entire league. And almost immediately she did. Attendance exploded across the WNBA. Arenas that had struggled to fill seats suddenly had fans lined up hours before tip-off. Television ratings skyrocketed to levels the league had never seen before. Entire cities started selling out games the moment tickets were released. But the success came with a price. The spotlight on Clark grew so intense that every move she made became a national headline. Every game turned into an event. Every possession felt like a moment the entire basketball world was watching. And the pressure that came with that spotlight was unlike anything the WNBA had ever experienced. Opposing teams circled Indiana on their calendars. Veteran players wanted to prove a point. Fans debated every call, every foul, every rivalry. And while millions of viewers were enjoying the drama from home, Clark was dealing with something far more exhausting behind the scenes. Because the rookie season that looked glamorous from the outside was actually a non-stop storm. Physical hits, endless media pressure, internal team struggles, coaching decisions that didn't always make sense. It became clear very quickly that Clark wasn't just playing basketball anymore. She was carrying the weight of an entire league's future. And as the season slowly unfolded, something inside the Indiana Fever organization began to change. The quiet rookie who had arrived in training camp ready to prove herself was no longer simply following orders. She was learning how much power she actually had. Power that came from millions of fans. Power that came from record-breaking revenue. Power that came from being the one player every single team in the league suddenly depended on for attention. By the time the season ended, one thing had become impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a rookie anymore. She had become the most important business asset in the entire WNBA. And once that realization settled in, everything about her relationship with the Indiana Fever began to shift. Because according to insiders around the league, Clark was no longer willing to simply endure the chaos that defined her first year. This time, she wanted changes. Real changes. Changes that could reshape the entire direction of the franchise. But to understand why those demands started appearing behind the scenes, you have to go back to the very beginning of that rookie season. Because what Caitlin Clark experienced during her first year in the WNBA was far more intense than most fans realized. And the reality of that season is what forced her to start thinking very differently about her future in Indiana. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a WNBA court, the pressure was immediate. She wasn't entering the league as a normal rookie. Most first-year players arrive quietly. They spend months adjusting to the speed of the professional game. They learn from veterans. They slowly find their place within the league. That was never going to happen with Clark. Before she even played her first professional game, the expectations were already overwhelming. Millions of new fans were watching the WNBA for the very first time because of her. Television networks were promoting games around her schedule. Opposing arenas were suddenly filled with people wearing number 22 jerseys, even when the Fever were the visiting team. Everywhere she went, the attention followed. But with that attention came something else. A target. Because inside the WNBA, many veterans had spent years grinding through a league that rarely received the spotlight it deserved. Some players had built their entire careers without experiencing the level of attention Clark received before her first game even tipped off. So when the season began, the message from opposing teams was clear. If Clark wanted to dominate the league, she was going to have to earn it the hard way. And the physicality started almost immediately. Night after night, defenders pressured her the moment she crossed half court. Hard screens, aggressive traps, physical bumps that tested her endurance. Every possession turned into a battle. The rookie wasn't just learning the professional game. She was surviving it. Fans watching from home began to notice the pattern quickly. Clips of Clark getting knocked to the floor started spreading across social media. Commentators debated whether referees were allowing too much contact. Some called it normal rookie treatment. Others believed something else was happening. They believed opponents were deliberately testing the league's newest superstar. Every game seemed to bring another moment that sparked debate. Another collision. Another controversial foul. Another highlight showing Clark hitting the hardwood while referees swallowed their whistles. And while she rarely complained publicly, the toll was obvious. Professional basketball seasons are exhausting even under normal circumstances. But Clark wasn't dealing with normal circumstances. She was playing through one of the most physically demanding rookie seasons in league history while carrying the expectations of millions of fans. Travel days became recovery days. Practices became shorter. Every game demanded enormous energy just to create space on the court. But the physical hits weren't the only challenge. Because while Clark was battling defenders every night, the Fever were also struggling to find consistency as a team. The roster was still rebuilding. The chemistry between players was developing slowly. Some games looked promising, showing flashes of the fast-paced offense that made Clark famous in college. Other games looked disorganized. Possessions stalled. Momentum disappeared. And critics began asking uncomfortable questions about whether the system around Clark was actually helping her succeed. There were moments during the season where the offense seemed to slow down at the worst possible times. Instead of letting Clark push the pace and create chaos in transition, the team sometimes fell into slower half-court sets that allowed defenses to crowd her. Fans watching closely began to wonder if the Fever were using their star the right way. But through all the challenges, Clark continued to produce. She broke rookie records. She delivered highlight passes that left defenders frozen. She hit three-pointers from distances that forced opposing coaches to completely redesign their defensive strategies. Every time critics questioned whether the rookie could handle the pressure, she answered with another performance that reminded everyone why she had become a phenomenon in the first place. Still, the season was exhausting. By the time the final games approached, it was clear that Clark had experienced a baptism by fire unlike anything most rookies face. She had taken hits. She had faced relentless media attention. She had carried expectations that normally take years for players to develop. And somewhere along the way, something important had changed. The rookie who arrived quietly at the beginning of the season was no longer just adapting to the league. She was starting to understand her influence. She could see the packed arenas. She could see the television ratings climbing. She could see how much attention the league suddenly received every time she stepped onto the floor. And that realization would eventually lead to something far bigger than just basketball adjustments. Because once Clark recognized the level of power her presence created, she began thinking about how that power could reshape the environment around her. But the first step in that transformation would come from one simple realization. If she was going to continue carrying the WNBA spotlight, the Indiana Fever would need to start protecting their biggest star much better than they had during her rookie year. And that realization would spark the first major change that insiders say Clark wanted to see happen inside the organization. But what that demand involved would send shockwaves through the entire franchise. By the time Caitlin Clark's rookie season reached its final stretch, one reality had become impossible to ignore. She wasn't just another player on the roster. She had become the engine powering the entire franchise. Every arena the Indiana Fever visited suddenly looked different from previous seasons. Ticket demand exploded. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were now filling seats hours before tip-off just to see Clark warm up. Merchandise lines wrapped around arena concourses. Television networks that had rarely paid attention to the league were suddenly broadcasting Fever games nationwide. In a matter of months, one rookie had transformed the economic gravity of the entire organization, and everyone inside the Fever front office knew it. But while the financial boom was exciting, it also created a new kind of pressure. Because when one player becomes responsible for so much attention, the stakes surrounding that player change dramatically. Clark wasn't just Indiana's point guard anymore. She had become their most valuable asset, which made the physical punishment she endured during games far more concerning than many fans initially realized. Throughout the season, viewers repeatedly saw moments where Clark absorbed hard contact. Defenders bumped her off screens. Opponents trapped her aggressively near half-court. In several games, she was knocked to the floor in plays that sparked heated discussions across social media. Fans debated whether the referees were allowing too much contact. Commentators wondered whether the league needed to step in to protect its newest superstar. But behind the scenes, the conversations inside the Fever organization were becoming even more serious. Because the team began recognizing something very simple. If Caitlin Clark ever suffered a serious injury, the ripple effects could impact far more than just one roster spot. It could impact ticket sales. It could impact television ratings. It could impact sponsorship deals and league visibility. Clark's health had suddenly become one of the most important variables in the business of women's basketball. And according to insiders close to the situation, that realization led to a growing discussion about how the Fever roster needed to evolve. The league had always been physical. That wasn't new. Veteran players prided themselves on tough defense and competitive intensity. But the Fever roster lacked something that many championship teams rely on: an enforcer, a player willing to step into confrontations, someone who could deliver hard screens, defend aggressively, and make opponents think twice before targeting the team's star guard. Throughout the season, there were several moments where Clark hit the floor and simply got back up without much reaction from teammates. No confrontation, no heated exchanges, just silence as the game continued. To some fans, it looked like normal basketball. To others, it looked like a team that hadn't fully adjusted to protecting its most valuable player. Inside professional sports, this type of dynamic matters more than people realize. Star players rarely demand protection publicly. That's not how the culture works. But organizations that win championships usually understand something important. When a generational talent arrives, the roster around them must evolve. They must create space for the star to thrive. They must absorb physical battles so the star doesn't have to fight everyone alone. And as the Fever began evaluating their future, the need for that kind of support became clearer. Clark was carrying enormous responsibility on the offensive end. She was orchestrating the team's pace, distributing the ball, stretching defenses with deep shooting, and constantly absorbing traps from defenders who knew slowing her down could disrupt the entire offense. Adding physical protection around her wasn't just about toughness. It was about longevity. Because if Clark was going to lead the Fever into a new era, she needed to stay healthy. The long WNBA season demands incredible endurance. Back-to-back games. Travel across the country. Defensive pressure every possession. Even the toughest athletes eventually feel the wear and tear. And Clark had already shown she was willing to absorb hits to keep competing. But the Fever began realizing that relying solely on her resilience wasn't sustainable. The roster needed players who could absorb the physical battles that come with protecting a superstar. This didn't mean turning the team into a group of enforcers. It meant building a lineup where opponents understood that targeting Clark would come with consequences. Hard screens, aggressive defense, veteran leadership that refuses to let cheap shots go unanswered. These subtle dynamics exist in every major professional sport. They aren't always obvious to casual viewers, but players recognize them immediately. And as the Fever studied their roster moving forward, one conclusion began taking shape. The team surrounding Clark needed to become tougher. Not reckless, not chaotic, but prepared. Prepared to handle the intense attention that comes with having the most watched player in the league. Because Clark's presence had already transformed Indiana's identity. The franchise that once struggled to remain competitive was suddenly one of the most talked about teams in basketball. That meant the expectations moving forward would only increase. Opposing teams would study Clark even more closely. Defenses would become more aggressive. Every matchup would carry extra intensity. And if the Fever truly wanted to compete for championships, they needed to ensure their star guard wasn't forced to carry every physical battle alone. But the deeper the organization looked at its situation, the clearer something else became. The issues surrounding Clark weren't only happening on the court. In fact, the chaos inside the Fever organization during parts of the season may have been even more frustrating than the physical hits she absorbed during games. Because while Clark was battling defenders every night, the system around her sometimes seemed completely out of sync with the type of player she actually was. And the growing frustration surrounding that system would soon trigger one of the biggest decisions the Indiana Fever had made in years. A decision that would completely change the direction of the franchise. because the next move the organization made didn't just involve the roster. It involved the person standing on the sidelines holding the clipboard. And when that decision finally happened, it sent a clear message throughout the entire WNBA. The Caitlin Clark era in Indiana was about to enter a completely new phase. The physical battles Caitlin Clark faced during her rookie season were obvious to everyone watching. The bruises, the aggressive traps, the defenders crowding her before she even crossed half court. But inside the Indiana Fever organization, there was another problem quietly building behind the scenes. And this one had nothing to do with opposing teams. It had to do with the system the Fever were running. Because for a player like Caitlin Clark, the system matters just as much as the talent surrounding her. Clark didn't become a record-breaking phenomenon in college by playing slow, predictable basketball. Her entire style is built on chaos. Fast pace, transition offense, long-range shooting that forces defenses to panic the moment she steps across half court. She thrives when the game moves quickly, when defenses are scrambling, when teammates cut and space the floor so she can create passing angles that most players don't even see. But during large stretches of the rookie season, something felt slightly off about how the Fever were using her. Fans watching closely started noticing it. Instead of constantly pushing the tempo, Indiana sometimes slowed things down. Possessions would settle into traditional half-court sets that allowed defenses to collapse around Clark. Opposing teams began loading two defenders at the top of the key, forcing the ball out of her hands before she could create anything dynamic. The result was frustration. Not explosive frustration. Clark rarely showed that publicly, but basketball analysts could see the tension building. There were moments when the Fever offense looked unstoppable: quick passes, deep threes, transition layups, highlight plays that electrified arenas. Then there were other moments where the offense suddenly looked stagnant. Movement slowed, spacing disappeared, and Clark found herself trying to create magic while surrounded by defenders. The contrast between those two versions of the Fever became one of the most debated topics of the entire season. Commentators asked whether the coaching philosophy truly fit the team's most important player. Former players on television panels began discussing it openly. Some believed the Fever were still running an outdated system that didn't fully unlock Clark's strengths. Others believed the team simply needed more time to build chemistry. But as the season unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear. The Fever weren't just developing a rookie. They were managing the most influential player the league had ever seen enter the professional game. And when you have a talent that unique, the margin for error becomes extremely small. Inside the organization, conversations started happening. Quiet conversations. The kind that don't appear in headlines until months later. Executives began reviewing the direction of the team. Analysts studied how the offense functioned when Clark pushed the pace compared to when the team slowed things down. Coaches examined film, looking for ways to unlock the full potential of their young star. But the deeper those conversations went, the clearer one reality became. The Fever needed a system that matched the future of the game. And that meant embracing a faster, more modern style of basketball. The turning point arrived shortly after the season ended. In a move that surprised many fans but had been quietly building behind the scenes, the Fever made a major coaching change. Christy Sides, who had led the team during Clark's rookie season, was no longer the head coach moving forward. Instead, the franchise brought back a familiar face: Stephanie White. For longtime Indiana basketball fans, the hire immediately made sense. White had deep roots in the state and a strong reputation as an offensive-minded coach who understood modern basketball spacing and pace. She had previously coached in the WNBA and built a reputation for developing guard play and creating dynamic offensive systems. And perhaps most importantly, she understood exactly the type of player Caitlin Clark was. A playmaker who needed freedom. Freedom to push the ball. Freedom to shoot deep. Freedom to create unpredictable offensive sequences that forced defenses into chaos. The moment the hiring announcement became public, reactions across the basketball world were immediate. Some analysts called it the perfect move. Others believed it signaled something bigger. Because coaching changes like that rarely happen in isolation. They usually reflect a shift in organizational philosophy. And in Indiana's case, the message was clear. The Fever were no longer experimenting with their future. They were committing to it. Clark wasn't just a young player the team hoped would develop over time. She had become the centerpiece of the entire franchise. The system would now evolve around her. The roster would be built to complement her strengths. And the expectations surrounding the Fever suddenly changed overnight. This wasn't just a rebuilding team anymore. It was a team preparing to compete. But the coaching change was only the first step in that transformation. Because once the Fever committed to building around Clark's style of play, another major question immediately appeared. Who exactly would be sharing the court with her? Because while Clark had already proven she could create opportunities for almost anyone, championship teams rarely rely on one star alone. They need partners, players who understand the system, players who can thrive in the chaos that great playmakers create. And during the second half of Clark's rookie season, one player had quietly begun forming exactly that kind of connection with her. A connection that could shape the future of the Fever offense. Her name was Kelsey Mitchell. And what happened with Mitchell's contract situation would soon become one of the most important decisions the franchise had to make. Because losing her might mean losing the chemistry that had finally started to unlock Clark's full potential. But keeping her would require the Fever to make a financial commitment they had rarely made before. A commitment that could reveal just how serious the organization truly was about building a contender around their new superstar. And the decision they made next would send a powerful message to the rest of the league. By the time the Fever began reshaping their coaching staff, another issue was already waiting on the front office's desk. And this one carried enormous consequences. Because while Caitlin Clark had clearly become the face of the franchise, basketball is never won by one player alone. Every great superstar eventually needs the right partner beside them. Someone who understands their rhythm. Someone who can read their instincts without needing to think about it. Someone who turns difficult plays into effortless chemistry. And during the second half of Clark's rookie season, that kind of connection started appearing in Indiana. The player on the other end of that chemistry was veteran guard Kelsey Mitchell. At first, the partnership didn't look perfect. The early games of the season were messy. Clark was adjusting to the speed of the professional game. Mitchell had spent years carrying much of Indiana's scoring load herself. Both players needed time to understand how their styles could coexist. There were possessions where they looked slightly out of sync, moments when the spacing felt awkward. But something interesting began happening as the season progressed. Game by game, the two guards started figuring each other out. Mitchell began learning exactly when Clark liked to push the pace. She understood how quickly Clark could find her cutting through defenders or spacing out along the perimeter. Clark, in return, started recognizing Mitchell's scoring instincts. She knew when Mitchell wanted the ball early in the shot clock. She knew how quickly Mitchell could create space for jump shots. And once that rhythm started clicking, the Fever offense suddenly looked very different. Opposing defenses faced a difficult choice. If they double-teamed Clark, Mitchell punished them with open shots. If they focused on Mitchell, Clark attacked the defense with her playmaking. The backcourt started producing explosive scoring runs that energized arenas and forced opposing coaches to burn timeouts. Fans noticed it immediately. The chemistry felt real. Two players operating with the kind of trust that usually takes years to develop. But while the on-court partnership looked promising, there was a major problem quietly approaching. Kelsey Mitchell's contract situation. At the end of the season, Mitchell was entering free agency. And in professional sports, free agency can completely change the direction of a franchise. The Fever front office suddenly faced a massive decision. Because Mitchell wasn't just any player available on the market. She was one of the most talented scoring guards in the league. And now she had proven she could thrive alongside the most famous rookie the WNBA had ever seen. That combination made her incredibly valuable. Not just to Indiana, but to every team in the league looking to strengthen their roster. Several franchises were already preparing to pursue Mitchell aggressively. Championship contenders knew that pairing her scoring ability with their own stars could transform their offense overnight, which meant Indiana risked losing one of Clark's most important teammates. And if that happened, the Fever would face a frustrating reality. Clark would have to rebuild chemistry with an entirely new backcourt partner. That process can take seasons. Timing, trust, understanding each other's tendencies. These things don't appear instantly. They develop slowly through repetition and experience. Losing Mitchell would mean starting that process all over again. For a franchise trying to accelerate its rise into championship contention, that risk was enormous. So the Fever made a decision that revealed exactly how serious they were about building around Caitlin Clark. They chose to prioritize Mitchell above almost every other move. Instead of letting her explore the open market freely, Indiana moved aggressively to secure her future with the team. The organization designated Mitchell as a core player, a move that essentially ensured she would remain with the franchise. Soon after, she signed a contract that reflected her importance to the team. The message from the Fever front office was unmistakable. They weren't interested in rebuilding slowly anymore. They were investing in a core built to win. Clark, Mitchell, Aaliyah Boston, a young foundation capable of growing together for years. The decision also showed something deeper. For the first time in a long time, Indiana was willing to spend aggressively to keep its most important players together. In previous seasons, the franchise had often played things cautiously when it came to contracts. But the arrival of Caitlin Clark had completely changed the economic landscape. The Fever were suddenly generating attention, revenue, and fan engagement that hadn't existed before, which meant investing in the roster was no longer just a basketball decision. It was a business decision. Keeping Mitchell ensured the team maintained one of the league's most exciting backcourts. It also showed Clark that the organization was willing to support her vision of building a competitive roster. But even as the Fever secured Mitchell's future, another factor was quietly increasing Clark's influence across the league. And this one had nothing to do with Indiana's roster. It had to do with money. Because while the WNBA was experiencing record-breaking attention thanks to Clark's arrival, a completely new basketball league was beginning to emerge. A league offering something the traditional system had never provided before: higher salaries, ownership opportunities, and financial packages that could completely change the balance of power in women's basketball. Suddenly, the most valuable players in the world had options. Real options. And if one of those players happened to be Caitlin Clark, the ripple effects could reach far beyond Indiana. Because the possibility of Clark exploring alternative opportunities created a level of leverage that very few athletes in the history of the sport had ever possessed. The Fever had just committed to building a roster around her. But now a bigger question was starting to appear. What if Clark realized she had even more power than the franchise expected? And what if that power allowed her to reshape not just the Fever, but the entire league? Because the next development surrounding Clark's future would introduce a completely new variable into the conversation. One that had owners, executives, and league officials across the WNBA watching very carefully. And it all revolved around a new basketball venture that was suddenly making waves across the sport. A league called Unrivaled. Just as the Indiana Fever were securing their roster and committing to a future built around Caitlin Clark, something unexpected began happening across the basketball world. A new idea started gaining momentum. At first, it didn't look like a direct threat to the WNBA. It was simply a new concept, a different style of league, a bold experiment that promised to give players something they had rarely experienced before: more control over their careers. The league was called Unrivaled, and the moment it was announced, people inside the basketball world started paying very close attention. Because Unrivaled wasn't just another startup league hoping to attract a few players for exhibition games. It was founded by some of the most respected stars in the sport, athletes who understood exactly what professional players wanted from the next stage of women's basketball. The concept was simple but revolutionary: a high-level 3-on-3 league that would operate during the traditional WNBA offseason. Games would be faster, courts smaller, offenses more explosive. But the real headline wasn't the format. It was the financial structure. For years, WNBA players had quietly expressed frustration with the financial limitations of the league. Many athletes were forced to spend their winters playing overseas in order to earn additional income. Some traveled across continents, joining international leagues in Europe or Asia just to supplement their salaries. The schedule was exhausting. Players would finish the WNBA season, take a short break, and then fly thousands of miles to compete again. The cycle repeated year after year. Unrivaled promised something different. Instead of traveling overseas, players could compete in a domestic league designed to offer significantly larger financial incentives. The new league proposed higher base salaries, investment opportunities, and equity stakes that allowed players to benefit directly from the growth of the league itself. For many athletes, that idea alone was exciting. But when analysts began imagining what could happen if the sport's biggest stars joined the project, the conversation changed completely. Because the success of a new league always depends on one thing: star power. And there was one player whose star power dwarfed everyone else in the sport: Caitlin Clark. Clark's arrival in the WNBA had already proven something remarkable. One athlete could change the entire economic landscape of a league. Television ratings skyrocketed when she played. Attendance numbers surged wherever the Fever traveled. Merchandise sales reached levels that the league had never experienced before. In other words, Clark didn't just bring fans. She brought revenue. And in professional sports, revenue creates influence. Suddenly, people across the basketball world began asking an interesting question. What would happen if Clark ever decided to participate in a new league like Unrivaled? The answer was obvious. It would instantly become the most talked-about basketball event of the offseason. Sponsors would rush to support it. Fans would follow. Television networks would compete for broadcast rights. Even the possibility of Clark joining a competing league created a ripple of uncertainty throughout the WNBA. Owners understood the situation clearly. Clark wasn't just a player under contract with the Fever. She was the most powerful marketing force women's basketball had ever seen. And because of that, she possessed something very few athletes ever gained during their early professional years: leverage. Now, to be clear, Clark never publicly threatened to leave the WNBA. She never issued ultimatums. She never made dramatic statements about abandoning the league. But sometimes influence doesn't require loud declarations. Sometimes influence comes from simple possibilities. The mere idea that Clark had alternative opportunities gave her tremendous power in negotiations. It meant she wasn't entirely dependent on one system. She had options. And when athletes have options, the entire dynamic between players and organizations begins to shift. For decades, professional sports leagues typically held the majority of power in negotiations. Teams controlled contracts, schedules, and player movement. But Clark's arrival coincided with a moment when that traditional balance was beginning to evolve. Players were becoming more visible, more marketable, more capable of generating their own revenue streams through endorsements and personal brands. And Clark represented the most dramatic example of that evolution. Her endorsement deals alone were reportedly worth millions of dollars. Major brands quickly recognized that her popularity extended far beyond the basketball court. She had become a cultural figure, a recognizable name even among people who had never watched a WNBA game before, which meant something very important. Clark didn't rely entirely on her basketball salary. Her influence and brand value created financial stability that most athletes could only dream of. And when a player reaches that level of independence, it changes how negotiations work. Teams can't simply rely on contracts to maintain control. They must also provide the environment that star players want to remain part of. For the Indiana Fever, that meant continuing to build a competitive roster. It meant creating a coaching system that unlocked Clark's strengths. And it meant protecting the health and well-being of the player who had become the centerpiece of their entire organization. But the ripple effects of Clark's influence weren't stopping with the Fever. Across the WNBA, players were starting to recognize something else. The massive attention surrounding Clark had exposed how valuable the league could become. Games were drawing record audiences. Corporate sponsors were showing increased interest. Media coverage was expanding rapidly. In other words, the economic potential of women's basketball had suddenly become impossible to ignore. And when players realized that potential, they began asking a simple question. If the league was generating more money than ever before, shouldn't the players benefit from that growth? That question would soon trigger one of the most significant developments in recent WNBA history. A development involving the players' union. A development that could reshape salaries, travel conditions, and revenue sharing across the entire league. And even though Caitlin Clark didn't directly organize the movement, her impact had helped spark the conversation. Because the economic explosion surrounding her rookie season had revealed something owners could no longer deny. Women's basketball was entering a completely new era, and the next battle over the future of the sport was about to begin. But while financial negotiations were quietly brewing at the league level, Clark was still dealing with another challenge much closer to home. One that had nothing to do with contracts or rival leagues. It had to do with the overwhelming media storm that followed her every move. Because the attention that made Clark the most famous player in the sport also created an exhausting environment off the court. And at times, it became almost impossible to escape. The spotlight never turned off. Every comment became a headline. Every rivalry became a national debate. And the way the Fever organization handled that media chaos would soon become another major issue behind the scenes. One that Clark reportedly wanted to change completely. Because if the franchise truly wanted its superstar to thrive, they needed to start protecting her off the court just as much as they were trying to protect her on it. If the physical battles on the court were exhausting for Caitlin Clark, the chaos waiting for her off the court might have been even more overwhelming. Because from the moment she entered the WNBA, the media attention surrounding her exploded to levels the league had never experienced before. Every practice became a news story. Every press conference turned into a headline. Even routine post-game interviews suddenly attracted national attention. At first, the attention seemed exciting. For years, WNBA players had fought to receive more media coverage. The league had struggled to break through into mainstream sports conversations, often overshadowed by larger leagues with massive marketing budgets. Clark's arrival changed that overnight. Sports networks began dedicating entire segments to WNBA games. Talk shows debated her performances. Social media platforms flooded with highlights and analysis every time she stepped onto the floor. It looked like the league was finally receiving the spotlight it had always wanted. But the sudden surge of attention came with consequences no one fully anticipated. Because the media circus surrounding Clark didn't just focus on basketball. It focused on everything. Reporters began asking questions about rivalries. They pushed narratives comparing Clark with other rising stars across the league. They looked for tension, conflict, and controversy that could generate viral clips. Sometimes the questions had nothing to do with the game itself. They revolved around social issues, cultural debates, and off-court narratives that quickly spiraled into heated discussions online. Clark often found herself sitting behind microphones answering questions that had little connection to the basketball court. Some interviews turned awkward. Some questions seemed oddly confrontational. Other moments felt like reporters were fishing for dramatic quotes that could ignite debates across social media. For a 22-year-old athlete still adjusting to the professional spotlight, the situation quickly became overwhelming. Clark handled the pressure with remarkable composure. Game after game, she remained calm during interviews. She avoided fueling controversies. She answered questions carefully, often redirecting attention back toward basketball whenever conversations drifted into uncomfortable territory. But maintaining that composure required enormous mental energy. The spotlight never disappeared. After every game, cameras waited. Microphones appeared. Journalists lined up with new questions. Sometimes dozens of them. And while the attention boosted the league's visibility, it also created a chaotic environment that the Indiana Fever organization struggled to manage early in the season. The team's public relations structure suddenly faced a challenge it had never encountered before. They weren't simply dealing with routine sports coverage anymore. They were dealing with a national phenomenon. Clark had become the most talked-about athlete in women's basketball, and the demand for access to her seemed endless. Some reporters pushed boundaries. Some asked repetitive questions about rivalries. Others attempted to frame normal basketball competition as personal drama between players. Each moment created new waves across social media. Fans debated everything. Commentators offered opinions. Entire storylines formed around brief interview clips. And through all of it, Clark remained at the center of the storm. As the season continued, insiders around the league began noticing something interesting. Clark rarely fueled the chaos herself. In fact, she often tried to avoid it. Her answers stayed focused on the team. She praised teammates. She avoided criticizing opponents. But even with her careful approach, the attention kept growing. Because the more viewers watched her games, the more reporters wanted access. And the more reporters gained access, the more stories began circulating. Eventually, the Fever organization realized something important. If the franchise wanted Clark to thrive long-term, the environment around her had to become more controlled. Constant controversy might generate headlines, but it also created distractions that could wear down any athlete over time. Inside professional sports, managing media access is often just as important as managing a roster. Teams must strike a balance between promoting their stars and protecting them from unnecessary distractions. For the Fever, finding that balance became increasingly urgent, because Clark's influence was expanding faster than anyone had predicted. She wasn't just drawing local media anymore. National outlets were covering her every move. International audiences were discovering the WNBA through her highlights. Even casual sports fans who rarely followed women's basketball suddenly knew her name. The level of exposure was historic. And historic exposure demands a different approach to media management. Behind the scenes, discussions reportedly began about how to restructure the team's communication strategy. More controlled interview settings. Stronger boundaries around locker room access. A more proactive public relations approach that shielded players from unnecessary controversy. The goal wasn't to silence media coverage. The goal was to guide it, to ensure that the conversation surrounding Clark stayed focused on what truly mattered. Basketball, her performance, the growth of the team. Because if the chaos surrounding her continued unchecked, it could easily become exhausting for both the player and the organization. And the Fever knew they couldn't allow that to happen. Clark had already endured an incredibly demanding rookie season. She had carried enormous expectations. She had battled defenders every night. She had navigated a media environment unlike anything the league had experienced before. But through it all, something else had quietly changed. The once quiet rookie, who entered the league simply hoping to compete, had grown into something far more significant. A leader. A player whose presence shaped the direction of an entire franchise. And as the season ended and preparations for the future began, Clark's role inside the team was evolving rapidly. Because the next stage of her career wouldn't just involve scoring points and breaking records. It would involve leadership. Leadership inside the locker room. Leadership within the organization. Leadership that could influence how the Fever built their team moving forward. But that new leadership role would come with challenges of its own. Because stepping into authority inside a professional locker room is never easy. Especially for a player who had only been in the league for a single season. Veterans had their own expectations. Traditions had existed for years. And suddenly, the rookie who arrived with the most attention in league history was beginning to shape the culture around her. What happened next inside the Fever locker room surprised many people around the league. Because the Caitlin Clark era wasn't just transforming Indiana's offense. It was transforming the hierarchy of the entire team. And not everyone expected that change to happen so quickly. By the time Caitlin Clark's rookie season finally came to an end, something inside the Indiana Fever locker room had quietly begun to change. At the start of the year, Clark entered the league the same way most rookies do. Quiet, observant, careful not to step on the toes of veterans who had spent years building their careers in the WNBA. Professional basketball locker rooms operate on an unspoken hierarchy. Experience usually determines authority. Players who have spent years in the league naturally command respect, while younger players are expected to listen and learn. Clark understood that when she arrived. She didn't walk into training camp trying to take over the team. She showed respect to the veterans. She focused on learning the system. She allowed the natural rhythm of the locker room to guide her early months in the league. But the situation surrounding Clark was unlike anything the WNBA had ever seen before. Because while she technically entered the league as a rookie, her influence outside the locker room was already enormous. Millions of fans were tuning in to watch her play. Corporate sponsors were investing heavily in her brand. Entire arenas were filling with people wearing her jersey. In a matter of weeks, Clark had become the most recognizable face in the sport. And that level of influence inevitably changes the dynamic inside any professional team. Veterans across the league had spent years fighting for the kind of attention Clark received almost instantly. Some players admired the excitement she brought to the sport. Others viewed the sudden spotlight with skepticism. There were moments early in the season where subtle tension could be felt across the league. Comments on podcasts. Interviews hinting at frustration. Debates about whether the league was focusing too heavily on one player. But as the season progressed, something important began happening. Clark kept producing. She didn't shrink under the pressure. She didn't collapse under the spotlight. Instead, she continued delivering performances that reminded everyone why the hype surrounding her had grown so massive. She broke rookie records. She orchestrated offense with creativity that forced defenses into impossible decisions. She demonstrated the type of competitive fire that teammates quickly recognized. And gradually, the atmosphere inside the Fever locker room began to evolve. The rookie who had entered the league quietly observing the veterans was slowly becoming one of the most important voices on the team. Not because she demanded authority, but because her performance earned it. Great players eventually gain influence through their actions. When teammates see someone consistently delivering under pressure, they naturally begin trusting that player's instincts. Clark's ability to read defenses, her willingness to take big shots, her vision as a playmaker, all of it started shaping how the Fever played. Teammates began adjusting their movement around her passing style, cutting earlier, spacing the floor wider, running the fast-paced offense that allowed Clark to operate at full speed. And once that rhythm began forming, something new appeared inside the locker room. Confidence. Confidence that the team had found a player capable of leading them into the future. Clark's leadership style wasn't loud or dramatic. She didn't storm into huddles shouting orders. Instead, her leadership emerged through preparation, through communication during games, through the constant pursuit of improvement. As the Fever prepared for the next season, it became clear that Clark's role inside the organization was expanding. She wasn't just the franchise's most marketable player. She was becoming its on-court leader. And that shift represented a major turning point for the team. Because once a franchise identifies its leader, everything else begins aligning around that player. Roster decisions, coaching philosophy, long-term strategy. The Fever had spent years searching for the cornerstone that could rebuild their identity. Now they had found one. But Clark's influence wasn't limited to Indiana. The ripple effects of her arrival were spreading throughout the entire WNBA. Because while the Fever were building their future around her, the league itself was undergoing a transformation. Attendance numbers were rising. Television audiences were expanding. Corporate sponsors were showing increased interest in the sport. And the conversations about player salaries, revenue sharing, and league growth were becoming louder than ever before. Clark had not personally orchestrated those conversations, but her presence had accelerated them. The explosion of interest surrounding her rookie season had revealed the untapped potential of women's basketball. Owners could see it. Players could see it. Fans could see it. The league was entering a new era. And whether anyone expected it or not, Caitlin Clark had become the catalyst for that transformation. Looking back at Caitlin Clark's rookie season, it's easy to focus on the highlights. The deep three-pointers, the record-breaking assists, the sold-out arenas that followed the Indiana Fever wherever they played. But the real impact of that season may go far beyond statistics. Because Clark's arrival didn't just bring excitement to the court. It changed the economics of the league. It changed the expectations surrounding the Indiana Fever. And it may have permanently altered the balance of power between players, teams, and the future of women's basketball. For the first time in years, the WNBA is facing a completely new reality. The sport is growing faster than anyone predicted. New leagues are emerging. Players are exploring new financial opportunities. And the spotlight surrounding women's basketball has never been brighter. Right at the center of that transformation stands a 22-year-old point guard who entered the league with impossible expectations. A rookie who didn't just survive the pressure. She thrived in it. The Indiana Fever now face enormous expectations moving forward. They've committed to building their future around Clark. They've reshaped their coaching staff. They've secured key teammates. And they're preparing for a season where the entire basketball world will once again be watching. But the biggest question still remains. Was Caitlin Clark simply the most exciting rookie the WNBA has ever seen? Or was her first season the beginning of a much bigger transformation for the entire sport? Because if the momentum surrounding her continues to grow, the next chapter of women's basketball might look very different from the one that came before. And the player who started that change might just be getting started. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story surrounding Caitlin Clark, the Indiana Fever, and the future of the WNBA is still unfolding, and the next chapter might be even more surprising than the first.